Well, good afternoon, everyone. As you know, we have a bill on the floor broadly supported on a bipartisan basis that came out of the Judiciary Committee unanimously. Senator Cornyn's done a lot of work on this. Senator Ayotte has done a lot of work on this. And I want to turn it over to them for their discussion of the issue. Also to point out the bill will be open for amendment. And if senators have better ideas or adjustments they want to make, we'll be happy to have those votes. Senator Cornyn and then Senator Ayotte.
Well, we are on the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, and this is one subject where Washington can come together on a bipartisan basis and do some real good on behalf of some of the most vulnerable victims of some of the most heinous conduct that most of us can imagine. With this legislation passed unanimously out of the Judiciary Committee in February, and I'm proud to have strong bipartisan co-sponsors on the bill. We make sure that victims are not treated as criminals, and that the people who purchase these various services are the focus of our efforts, the so-called demand side, not just the supply side. And we do provide up to $30 million of additional funds, primarily through fines paid for by the perpetrators of these crimes, into a fund that helps these victims, many of them very young, heal and get on with their lives in a productive way. So I'm very happy that, that Senator Reid decided to let us get on the bill, along with our Democratic friends, without going through the procedural hurdles. So we're on the bill now, and I trust this afternoon we'll start the process of considering amendments under an open process that the Majority Leader has said we will have. And anybody with a good idea is welcome to come down and offer it, and then we get to vote on it. At the end of the week, we'll look forward to passing this out of the Senate.
Well, I wanted to thank Senator Cornyn for his leadership, and this has really been a bipartisan issue in terms of the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, and the women of the Senate have actually collectively really gotten together and wanted to focus on addressing trafficking and ending what is modern-day slavery. As we stand here today, there are tens of thousands of children in the United States of America that are being trafficked, and they are being obviously mistreated. This really is modern-day slavery. And we've seen every single state impacted, every socioeconomic background, and every community this has happened. Before I came to the Senate, I served as Attorney General for the state of New Hampshire. I had the chance to not only work with law enforcement, but victims groups in New Hampshire on this issue. And I will tell you just some of the cases in a state like New Hampshire that we've already seen. We had a case where the police found and located a 15-year-old runaway who was being put up in a hotel room, and she was being sex trafficked and forced to see multiple clients a day. And this is happening in a state like New Hampshire. Other cases we've seen a connection between drug trafficking and sex trafficking. For example, there were women being put up in a hotel room in New Hampshire, and they were being controlled by heroin. In other words, the people trafficking them were saying, we're not going to give you the heroin, we're going to control the heroin supply. Cases where children and young women are forced to perform sex acts for money by using threats and access to drugs. What I've talked to you about today is happening everywhere in the United States of America. And so I'm so glad that this bill is coming to the floor, and this bill is going to ensure that the victims, those who are being trafficked, are treated truly as victims and not criminals, and that the criminals, those who are participating in trafficking, they are treated as the criminals, and that additional resources are going to victims so that victims are treated with dignity and respect and support, and that communities can have additional resources both for law enforcement and victim service providers to ensure that we end this scourge of modern-day slavery. That it's hard to believe in this day and age in the United States of America that people are still being trafficked. And so I think of all the issues that cross party lines, this is one that deserves our immediate attention, and I'm very glad that the leader is bringing it to the floor. And I look forward to working with all of my colleagues to get this passed. Thank you.
Senator Ayotte is absolutely right. It doesn't matter where you come from in the country. I come from the middle part of the country, and we've always felt like our safe communities are kind of insulated from these types of issues, but South Dakota is dealing with this issue, these heinous crimes, just like every other state in the union, and it's time that we spoke, and time that we did something about it. This is an example, as Senator McConnell pointed out, of what can happen, though, when you open up the Senate again. This bill moved to the House last year, wasn't considered by the Senate. We're going to have an opportunity to have an open process, open it up for debate. And we've moved a number of bills this year that way, the TRIA legislation, the Keystone Pipeline, of course, the Clay Hunt veteran suicide bill, legislation providing restitution for victims of child pornography, all legislation that's moved across the floor of the United States Senate. And this is another example where there's an issue, there's bipartisan support, something that's important to people all across this country, particularly to the victims, that provides law enforcement with the tools that it needs to target traffickers and to restore the lives of the victims. And so this is a piece of legislation that I look forward to supporting, and I hope we can have many more like it, where we can get bills to the floor, open it up, allow amendments to be debated, and to move forward with legislation, policies that are really important to the people in this country.
Yesterday, the CBO came out with another report on the president's health care law, and while the White House has been claiming victory as a result of this report, I would suggest that the president think about the people who have been actually impacted by his law, because there's bad news for many of the people who are buying their health insurance through the exchange. The CBO report says that next year the rates for their premiums will go up 8% for the benchmark premium. The year after that, another 8%. The year after that, another 8%. People across the country cannot afford what is supposedly the Affordable Care Act. The president never talked about this when he was trying to sell the law. He was saying that the premiums would go down for everyone. This is another one of the reasons why the health care law for people all across the country continues to be unaffordable, unworkable, and very unpopular. So I would suggest the president, rather than claiming victory, thinks about the people that have been harmed by the health care law, and specifically the mandates that they buy insurance that he says they need, rather than what works for them and their families, so that it becomes affordable for them, not what the president thinks they need. They're much more prepared to know what insurance they need, they want, and they can afford, not Barack Obama.
Well, it's already been said that the legislation on the floor this week affects every state, affects many, many cities in our country. It's not just sex trafficking, it's labor trafficking. It's widely supported. It's good that the minority decided we could go ahead and let the Senate work like the majority leader wants the Senate to work. Legislation on the floor, open for amendment. This particular legislation is endorsed by over 200 advocacy groups, the NAACP, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Rights for Girls, the National Association to Protect Children, the Fraternal Order of Police, the National Conference of State Legislators. It's the kind of work that needs to be done. I'm glad to see we're doing it, and thanks for Senator Cornyn and Senator Ayotte for the real leadership they provided on the legislation we're dealing with this week.
Yeah.
When do you plan to bring the Attorney General nominee to a floor vote?
Yeah, I think we'll be dealing with the Attorney General nomination next week.
Given the criticism that the letter that many of you signed to the leadership of Iran has gotten, including from Democrats who support the Cornyn and his legislation, do you still believe it was a good idea? And how do you respond to the president saying you're making common cause with hardliners?
Yeah, look, I think it's pretty obvious that the president does not want Congress to have any say-so over the bad deal that we are certain he seems to be inclined to make. An issue this magnitude with an enemy of the United States, which is fomenting problems in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza, in Yemen, to make a deal of this magnitude with one of the worst regimes in the world without any congressional input leads you to believe he's going to make the deal that we all fear he's going to make. Now, our Democratic friends never seem to want to deal with this issue. At the request of the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, we've delayed dealing with the issue, and we'll just see after March the 24th whether there are enough Democratic senators not to just ensure passage of the Corker bill, but also to ensure that the veto that we anticipate coming, the president's already said he'd veto it, will be overridden. But I think all of us should be suspicious of an administration that is so intent on keeping the elected representatives of the American people out of this deal. You have to ask yourself why. Why? And there's only one conclusion you could reach, which is that he intends to make a bad deal. Anything that leaves the Iranian nuclear infrastructure in place and ignores their behavior on a whole range of other issues, fomenting problems all around the world, building IEDs that have killed and injured American soldiers, you just have to be suspicious as to why the administration would not want our participation. At some point, hopefully we'll be in a position to vote on the Corker proposal. Let me suggest, if there is not a deal, we've had some of our Democratic friends say the choice is between this deal and war. No. The choice is between this deal and greater sanctions, because we finally discovered one thing that works here. One thing. Sanctions. That's what brought them to the table. I would remind all of you the president did not want the sanctions bill he got. It was so overwhelming in Congress that he signed it, but he was opposed to it and tried for years to prevent it from being presented to him. Well, he finally got it and he signed it. It clearly works. So if there is no deal, the answer is tougher sanctions. We know tough sanctions work.
Secretary Hillary Clinton is set to speak momentarily about this controversy around her emails. What questions do you still have about that, about her use of a proprietary or personal email at the State Department, and do you think anything should be done?
Well, I think we first need to know what the facts are. I believe, is she having a press conference today?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, for myself, I think I'll wait and hear what she has to say. It strikes you, upon learning about it, as rather unusual, and whether or not it's required by law, I guess, will be sorted out by the administration. But you got to wonder why the Secretary of State would do something like this, and maybe she'll have some answers for that at 1:30.
Senator Connor, do you think it was proper for Senator Reid to arrange a meeting with Senator Menendez, to talk to the Justice Department to talk about a regulation that was a problem for a major Democratic donor?
Yeah, I think that Senator Reid will be here shortly. I think it'd be a good question for you to ask him. I'm going to take one more. John. Yeah.
Well, the legislation that the Senate unanimously agreed to go on yesterday was filed on January the 13th with Democratic co-sponsors, Senator Klobuchar, Senator Wyden, and Republican co-sponsors, Senator Kirk and myself. It was out in the public domain for a month before it was marked up in Judiciary Committee on February the 26th, and all members of the Judiciary Committee voted to support it. So that leads me to believe that some of the suggestions being made now that there were provisions in the legislation that people didn't know about are simply untrue. That presupposes that none of their staff briefed their senators on what was in the legislation, that nobody read a 68-page bill, and that senators would vote for a bill, much less co-sponsor it, without reading it and knowing what's in it. None of that strikes me as plausible.
Senator, can you explain the thinking behind including that provision in the human trafficking legislation?
The Hyde Amendment has been the law of the land since 1974, I believe, and it's contained in all legislation funding legislative appropriation riders now. All this does is maintain the status quo by making sure that this Crime Victims Compensation Fund, that the funds available from that fund are constrained by the same constraint that exists under all other federal law. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.